people who do background checks, either HR or a third party. What are some NSFW things you've discovered that have disqualified a candidate for a job? Woman dropped off a resume at the retail location I worked at. On the cover letter, it said, "Google me." She was a minor actress back in the '80s. Coworker Googled, and the first thing that pops up is her recent Met arrest. Story 2. I've been a background investigator for almost 10 years. I've seen a lot. One that really gets under my skin is a guy who applied to work with the Boy Scouts as some sort of... He had 15 separate charges of... He served 20 years, and I guess he thought it just fell off his record. Story 3. Former adult star. She put herself through college before as an escort and had done a few movies. We found this out and hired her anyway. She was a great employee, never a problem. She did have a picture at her desk of her and Ron Jeremy, but there was nothing NSFW about it. It was kind of funny when people were trying to figure out where they knew him from. Story 4. We were trying to hire an accountant, had one lined up with amazing credentials. Then he disclosed he had gone to prison for funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his previous company's books. Story 5. I'm the candidate. I have a very uncommon last name, and I have a cousin with a very similar first name who is about the same age as me. Sean versus Sean kind of deal. It wasn't intentional. I've had some legal issues in the past from being homeless, but nothing crazy. My cousin was found guilty of accessory to murder and a bunch of other crimes from a substances deal gone wrong, and will be in prison for the foreseeable future. When you Google Sean Warner, you get Sean Warner found guilty on 12 counts including murder. It doesn't show up on background checks, but Googling me is a doozy. Story 6. Not HR, but when I was hired into a management position at a previous job, one of my employees informed me that he had worked with one of his newer teammates at a previous job and that this guy was super sketchy. Unfortunately, that wasn't really anything I could act on, but I quickly saw exactly what he was talking about. My team did field work, and this guy would routinely fall off the radar, never answered his phone, and frequently had to take time off work because, according to him, he had been working as a cop before my predecessor hired him, and he said he was being called to testify in court. A few months later, the same employee who warned me about this guy brought me a news article detailing how this guy had been tried and found guilty of writing and cashing fraudulent checks on behalf of an elderly person in his care. The court had nothing to do with his time as a cop. He was the defendant, not a witness. I took everything to heart, and we ended up terminating it. Story 7. Assistant recommended a candidate while I was on bereavement. Passed the background check. But when I returned, I had asked if anyone had looked this candidate up before sending the offer letter. Turned out the background check didn't catch that they were named in an active grand jury trial for assaulting. They were given a hush plea deal by the state because they were turning in other counselors, who were in on it with them, with many victims over the course of 2 decades. And for some reason, this information was not discovered by the company we use for those checks. We no longer use this company. Story 8. Not quite a background check, but I was helping do preliminary interviews for entry-level position. One of the questions was, have you ever done this type of work before? She said she had, and elaborated that she was fired because she slept with her manager. And when he wrote her up for something, she went to HR to get it taken off her record, using her relationship with the manager as leverage. When I told her we have a strict policy regarding relationships within reporting management, she put her hand on my knee and asked if there's anything she can do to convince me to hire her. Hard pass. That kind of not-so-subtle unprofessionalism isn't what we do here, miss. Story 9. Not in HR. But we Googled his name and up comes his photo in a news story about him and his wife in a fraud court case. He interviewed great, but we knew he would never pass a background check after that search. Did not disqualified, but up popped her page for dominatrix services with her photo in a skimpy leather outfit with a whip. Interesting side gig. Story 10. Day spa applicant for massage position had several arrested for assaulting and wanted us to put him in a room with them alone for an hour. Hard pass. Story 11. I do a ton of background checks for different things, including people applying to be foster parents. For all of the other checks, I almost never have anything to send back. For people applying to foster, it can be up to 75 pages of police contact I have to send in. It's incredibly disheartening, and a lot of the crap I've seen in their criminal histories has made me sob. I wish I was just allowed to stamp a giant no on some of them. Literally 9 out of 10 applicants have police contact that is serious enough to be included in the background. Story 12. A new hire was using substances and her son passed from it. She was a top candidate too for the position as a project manager. Was hired and then offer rescinded. She went to jail and is now out working in addiction recovery. You would never have known looking at meeting her. Story 13. Not HR and not a background check. I handled social media. I found WTF social posts roasting the company from 2 new hires. The CEO had held a meeting in the company lobby. We basically had a long company lunch and went back to work. Later that day, I was going back to my desk from a bathroom break when I swiped my phone open to check on social posts. I opened LinkedIn. and I had several messages in my inbox, which was unusual. It's important to note here that the company lobby doubled as a demo room for products, and when the doors were closed to the lobby, we knew that a demo was occurring. The lobby had no windows to verify. After the company meeting, the doors had been shut. Turns out, it wasn't because of a demo. Most of the messages I had received contained no text, just links to other posts. Filmed and photographed in the lobby, the videos, captions, and still images included the employees in provocative poses, twerking, mocking the CEO's earlier words, standing, sitting atop expensive products, dancing around like an escort tease atop the products, and overall crapting on the company's employees and leadership. The posts also included the company name and the CEO name, both intentionally misspelled multiple ways. It just so happened that these new employees were connected with friends of friends with several company employees, but not me. It traveled via DM like a G-Vine. My coworkers had sent the info to me because the HR director was not trusted, but they knew that I handled socials. The posts were all public, so when I opened the links, I screenshot them. There were nearly a dozen posts on LinkedIn. Why? Instead of going to my desk, I went to HR, who immediately went to the executive team. The newbies were canned fast after that. I never saw them leave. But I did later find out that, 1, the posts were required to be removed. 2, they were temp workers from a third party which had rules about social media. They lasted 7 business days at our job and likely lost their positions at the temp agency too. 3, they were personally fired by the CEO in his office. 4, some tellings of the firing, office gossip, included that they left crying from the tongue lashing they got, while others said that the CEO said little more than expressing his disappointment. Story 14. I don't do background checks for my company currently. But 2 things. Boring answer. Even if prerequisites require you have a degree, unless your position is academia-based or part of hiring out of college, it's possible your background check will not include double-checking your degree. If you have the practical experience and are the best person for the job, it's worth pursuing regardless of degree requirement. Fun answer. One time during an interview where a candidate was asked about learning from a professional mistake, they told me about how they were involved in a judicial dirty scandal. Maybe she thought it would come up in the background check. I can assure you, I wouldn't have known if it did. But boy, did she answer a lot of follow-up questions I sure didn't ask. Story 15. At my friend's company, a new guy got hired, and HR sent out a welcome email with his name and info. Someone Googled him and found out he was in the middle of a trial for stealing identities of clients at his last company. He was fired within an hour of the welcome email being sent out. Story 16. Not HR. It. We had a new guy start a few months ago while HR ran the background check. The guy failed and I had to disable all his access. HR wouldn't tell me what they found, but HR said that anyone could Google his name, wink wink. I went to lunch and Googled his name. He got busted in a pedo sting in 2019 and spent some time in prison. He got busted along with 20 other guys. Bye, Felicia. Story 17. Not a background check as much as just being nosy. Company couldn't get new employees, so stopped doing background check. New guy was giving me creepy vibes, so I looked him up. He's a registered offender. He's still employed because there's nothing they can do about it now. Story 18. Literally anything you can imagine. The ones that surprise me the most, however, are the ones that are so relevant to the job that I can't believe you even applied for that position. Applying for an accounting or fund management position, credit card fraud, theft, and embezzlement. A job that requires lots of plane and international travel. FBI no-fly list. Yet these people are the most heartbroken when I tell them why they didn't get the job. They're also the ones I feel the least bad about. Story 19. This didn't happen to me as our person, but to a friend who applied for a job. She was a prolific fan fiction writer, back before fanfic became a common thing. She wrote NSFW fics for a couple of very popular fandoms, and used her real email, which included her real name. Despite several of us warning her that this was a bad idea, she blew off our warnings and poo-pooed the idea. So her husband passed, and she goes back to work, or at least starts looking for a new job. She applies for a job with the city and gets an interview for a great position. She gets to the interview, and the interviewer pulls out a stack of printouts and asks her if she's the author. She looks at the stack, gets up and walks out. She eventually got a decent job and took down her website with all of her fics, although you can still find them if you know her email. Story 20. Not a background check guy, but I got hired at a government agency doing admin work. A guy in another department was leaving, and they asked if I could take over some of his tasks while they searched for a replacement, which was fine with me, so I shadowed him for a couple weeks. Hated the guy. Talked to me like I was a toddler. Everything was in a really sing-song voice and would over-explain things in such a weird way. I once wore a shirt that had a dinosaur motif, and he leaned over me, hands on his knees, and said, "Wow, dinosaurs? Like Jurassic Park? Do you know Jurassic Park? It's a movie. It's got dinosaurs. You should see it. But it's a little scary. Make sure you have some cartoons to watch after, okay?" For context, I'm a 30-year-old man. He was probably in his mid to late 30s as well. Dude just had a super strange energy and gave big predator vibes. Anyway, I Googled him out of sheer curiosity as to what his deal was. Sure enough, first thing that pops up is a mugshot. Turns out he'd had some unknown trouble in high school and went to college late. Joined a frat, despite being 28. The frat brother said he was very weird, but was admitted because he was willing to buy them booze. During a party, the house got raided when 2 girls were found unconscious in the house. Guy's room turns out to be filled with substance. He managed to get out of any serious charges because the substances were for personal use to improve his school performance, which is coded language for wealthy parents, I think. Anyways, how he got hired at the government agency baffles. What's more, he was leaving us for a higher power position at a different government post. Dude gave me massive ick. Story 21. Not me, but a friend interviewed a guy who was going to work at some apartment buildings, doing odd jobs, fixing stuff, etc. My friend got a call from his former boss, who apparently was tipped off by one of the tenants there that recognized him. IDK if they worked with him or knew him some other way. But I guess they found out he was going to be working there and was like, oh no. Long story short, he was fired because he was caught squatting in one of the empty duplex buildings for like 3 or 6 months. They don't know for sure how long he was in there. At the place he used to work at, back in like the 90s. This was in the late 2000s when my friend was interviewed. He had been pissing in the non-functional sinks and toilet. They don't know where he was pooping. The building apparently needed a ton of work done, so they weren't doing anything with it for nearly a year except mowing the lawn. So the building had no power and no running water. They found a sleeping bag, and like a trash can, it was mostly empty. But the entire inside of the building not only smelled like piss, but old, stale, rotting piss. You ever peed in a toilet? Forget to flush and come back a few hours later and it smells rancid? Imagine that, but 3 to 6 months. The former duplex owner said he couldn't even go in there for a second. He had to walk around in short bursts, holding his breath, and then run outside. But the smell got stuck to his clothes. He said it smelled worse than rotting roadkill, like it was actual poison. So my friend wasn't going to hire him already. So me, him, and our other friend look him up, and he's got a criminal record. A long rap sheet that's mostly domestic abuse all throughout the 80s and 90 AS. And then it stopped in like the late 90s, and we were like, why'd the charges suddenly stop? Oh, he was in prison. I feel like if I was going to squat in a building with no running water, I would just piss in some bottles and throw them away when they're full, or pee outside. Honestly, if I were in his position, I'd just tell the duplex owner I need a place to stay, and I'd live in that building and work on it myself. I just need the water and power turned on, and we can negotiate payment versus rent versus the work I put into it. But he was definitely also doing substance. Like that's probably where all the money he earned went. Story 22. I had the recruiter at my job hire a guy. He had a very unique first and last name. When we brought him in for his final interview, a girl I work with said, "You can't hire him," and looked legitimately scared. Come to find out, after a conversation with her and a quick Google, he was currently facing charges for statutory abuse and lots of other scary crap. The victim was one of her close friends. I don't even know why we have a recruiter or why they pretend to do background checks. Story 23. My brother works in schools and was working in a tiny private school, which about 10 kids, yes, they exist, and was sited in a few ordinary residential houses that were knocked together. They were advertising for a new tutor, and a guy was being interviewed while my brother was teaching in the same building. All of a sudden, screaming and yelling, and he came running, being the only guy on staff in the building at that point. The interviewee was really kicking off and screaming and yelling at the interviewer, and they had to call the police. Turns out, he was a known pedo who literally had just got out of prison. And one of the first things he did was go to a school where he thought they would be lax on their hiring requirements and try to apply for a job as a tutor, where he would be working alone with a child in a room for much of the time, even if that room was literally next door to other classrooms and people were always around. He had a long list of such offenses with very little gaps between them. And what made him kick off? They got through all the standard interview parts, thought he'd make a great teacher, and they were thinking of hiring him. So they asked him a pretty standard question for any school. Do you mind if we do a police check? He wasn't happy, but when he realized that they meant that they would have to wait for it to come back before he could ever work with children, he got enraged. That triggered him immediately, and he started kicking off and eventually was arrested. A condition of his previous offenses was that he was banned from even trying to apply to work in a protected position, being on the offenders register, etc. So it was an easy arrest. Story 24. I helped out with interviews for new hires for a bit after they had the preliminary HR and recruiter talks. Ours were meant to be more technical and specific to our work. We're in the DC region, so it isn't uncommon to see people job hop and see it on resumes where they spend maybe a year or two at a job and move to another, usually a red flag most other places, but not necessarily here. Generally, I would take notes on the various skills and bullet points on the resume and then do a Google search to see what else might come up. I like to compare to any LinkedIn profiles I might come across. A few times I saw some major inconsistencies where it didn't quite line up with the resume we got. Like one guy either was working 2 jobs at once, or he had a large gap of no work for 2 years, depending on which source you believe. One guy we asked on the phone about why he left his last job after only 6 weeks, and he was a little evasive. It came up again when we had the in-person interview, where I was in the room with 2 others, while others in my leadership were called in from another state. This guy's body language and demeanor completely changed after the question came up again. He had been more positive and sitting up straight, forward, with direct eye contact. After the question, he had shrunk back into himself and tapped, shook his leg repeatedly while being unclear and evasive again, his eye contact downward and it meeting ours. Never found out what happened there, but it seemed it might not have been good. The worst had to have been a guy who had been consulting previously, but wanted to be more of an employee this time around. His expectations for income was a little too high. As consulting, they usually compensate for not getting benefits one would normally get as a full employee. I Googled his name, a very distinct name at that, and found a very recent arrest article. He has been on a date with a woman and took her back to his apartment, but then would not let her leave. It ended up with charges of essentially holding her hostage. The age, city he was from, and name all matched. Only one other person came up with his name, whom I'm assuming was his dad because he was about 30 years older and a dentist in the area. Not our kind of work. My supervisor decided to quietly cancel the interview before we even saw him, mostly saying his income expectations were not a good starting point. Story 25. I was HR in a unionized environment working directly with vulnerable people. One of the frontline workers referred her grandchild's baby mother. Resume looked adequate, interviewed really well. References were good. At time of verbal offer, I mentioned it was conditional on a background check. We don't require clean as long as it isn't a crime that puts vulnerable people at risk. She mentions she has something on her record. I assume something $50,000. She tells me it was for smuggling substances across the border. She loses her crap because I had to rescind offer. The person that worked for us and referred her was pretty pissed as well. Story 26. This isn't me, but a former coworker. Another guy from his town. Same first and last name, but not even related, is a low-key criminal. Lots of minor arrests for things like thefts. If you Google law-abiding coworker, you will get all the news stories about the other guy with his same name committing crimes. Eventually, he owned his own business, and it was clear those were different people. Story 27. I own a small business and will usually just Google applicant. In the last couple years, I've had some of the craziest results, actually. One popped up as attempted bank robbery. Another one was caught as part of a group that were scamming people with phone calls and emails. Story 20. I'm not in HR, but a few years ago, I was working at a big telecommunications type place, and my team got a new hire with an incredible resume, qualifications from Yale and Oxford type thing, which in my country is pretty unusual. Frankly, the role seemed a little beneath someone with his qualifications, so being the curious type, I Googled him. Turns out he had tried his hand at politics a few years earlier, but had been forced to drop out as a candidate after it came to light he had been charged, but not convicted, with abusing his ex-wife. Being the curious type, I found the news article relating to his arrest. He'd been upset that his ex-wife had not been suitably excited about a promotion or new job, so he dragged her across a parking lot by her hair. This information was not hard for me to find, but apparently the hiring folks at my company never looked for it. I mentioned it to my boss's assistant, who told my boss. He pulled me into a room in a panic and asked me not to mention it to anyone. I left a couple of months later, and as a parting gift told my colleagues to Google him. Bloke was a tool to everyone, so I had no problems making his life a bit uncomfortable. I checked back at his Google results a year or two later after someone asked after him. All those news stories about his arrest and dropping out of the election were gone. Someone did a great job astroturfing the guy. Story 29. Had a gentleman apply for a temporary office position. Under the section asking about criminal history in the smallest handwriting ever he wrote, he was a convicted pedo. Hard pass, sir. Story 30. This is one of my favorite stories. My first HR job. I did employee onboarding for a medium-sized company, 400 employees, that still acted like they were a small company. They were in a specialized construction industry. I was approached by our CEO and asked to rehire a former employee who had left, all I was told during. I said, of course, and reached out to start the process. Part of that process was the background check. I made sure the guy knew and he was okay with it. Well, I get the background check back, and it's 15 pages long and has 20 different convictions from the last 10 years or so, and even more before that, which are hard to ignore. Overall, I think this dude has like 40 criminal convictions in his lifetime. Many of these convictions took place prior to the first time he was hired by the company, including things like larceny, arson, violence towards others, etc. He would have been a huge liability and risk if he was hired. I have no issue giving people a second chance, and have worked for several companies who hire people in those situations. But this was a habitual bad dude. I had not yet looked at his prior employment file to see his previous background check. I did that and found even more convictions, bringing him up to 30 in the last 10 years. I also found out why he left. He had been fired for beating up an employee and stealing some of our highly specialized equipment, totaling around $10 million in damages altogether. He was arrested and spent some time in jail for the whole incident. And now that he was out of jail, the CEO wanted me to rehire him. I realized I was absolutely out of my depth, still 22, to have this conversation with the CEO about risk. So I showed the file to one of my colleagues that was also new to the company, but more experienced, and she absolutely flipped her lid. It was run up the flagpole to our VP of HR so he could talk the CEO out of rehiring him. I heard the CEO was really mad at me for running the background check because I would have never found out. I also think I shouldn't have run it for a different reason. I should have just looked up his file first instead of wasting that money on the check. Story 31. First day on the job, parent HR company called to say that they just got his substances test back and failed. Training was cut short, and he was escorted to the front door and told to check out of his hotel and change his flight home at his expense. Months later, second guy for same position was 2 weeks into the job and training when HR was informed about a felony case for theft that he was about to be sentenced for. We picked some winners. Story 32. Not me, but friend of mine works at a company that does hire people who have been in prison, and it is a fresh start for a lot of people. 2 problems, though. He has people who put no on their application when asked, "Have you ever been convicted of a crime?" And their background checks tell quite a different story. Automatic rejection. They know a background check will be done, so why lie? He doesn't want to know, so bye-bye. The second is anyone who's committed a crime and all other offenders. He's had people say yes to the question and be cagey about what they were convicted of. They are almost always offenders. Story 33. Employee. I'm trying to get my friend hired. Do y'all hire felons? Manager. Yeah, as long as it's not theft or murder. Employee. Oh, never mind, manager. Damn, what did he steal to get a felony? Employee. No, it was murder, manager. Silence. Story 34. Guy had a background as a male escort, admitted to using hard substances recreationally to keep his mind right, and popped hot on the pre-employment substances test. This was for a job at the local jail, which he had visited numerous times for several crimes. Story 35. Supervisor was leaving at my old job in the residential mental health field. One duty of supervisors where I worked was as a therapist for clients. This is important. And my work was looking for a replacement. One woman comes in, passes the background check, passes the interview, is very close to getting the job. She visits the facility for a tour to determine if it's the right fit. Immediately, we all get uneasy vibes. She's clearly very anxious and overwhelmed and just kind of off. My coworkers and I express our concerns, and apparently so did this lady because she contacted HR and politely refused the job due to the work environment being too chaotic. Eventually, a different replacement with different problems is found. I eventually leave because the work environment has become stupid toxic, and a year passes. Then I see on the news that a former resident hit 2 people and they pass. I notice that their roommate, who is named in the article, has a familiar-looking name. Look them up. It's the woman who was almost my supervisor. And how did I find her? She posted an ad for a roommate one freaking day after her old roommate hit 2 people in her house. No mention of anything, despite her name being connected to the biggest news story of the time. The HR department at my old work had to basically give people a training on avoiding media and what to do if subpoenaed. Just a really weird, sad situation all around. Story 36. Worked for a small tech firm. Very family-oriented operation. Pets in the office. Kids hanging out during the summer. Super chill. Had a need for an additional engineer. Candidate interviewed super great, but something they said caught my attention. Something about participating in a federal court case. I was a former paralegal and knew how to look up details, and a cursory search came up with a conviction for creation and distribution of CP. I screenshot it, sent it to our coup. I also sent it to the other people on the interviewing panel. We did interviews by panel because we worked as a team, and that interview ended pretty quickly. The things that really bothered me was our office was across the street from an elementary school. He was 18 at the time of conviction, and this was like 5 or 6 years later, but bro should have known absolutely not. Story 37. So my story is not exactly on target, but close enough. My husband and I had to go to court to testify as witnesses in a case. They screwed something up on our subpoenas, and instead of being told to go to a witness room, we were told to report to the courtroom. We didn't know anything about that at the time, of course. After a while, in walks a co-worker of mine. I called his name and waved, but he was very subdued in response. I didn't think anything of it because, again, we were there as witnesses, so we didn't think about why other people might be there. Eventually, he was called up and had been charged with domestic violence. I looked up his case later, and what do you know? It wasn't his first rodeo. I said nothing to anyone until the day after he left, and then I was like, hey guys, gather around. I don't believe his leaving had anything to do with his case. I don't recall if he was let go or if it was voluntary. But wow, talk about coincidence. Story 38. So I used to be the lead trainer for my old team. I would usually sit on the interview panels, but my boss would make the final decision. Person comes in, interviews well, we bring them on as a contractor. We knew they would have a very tough customer, so we give them a month of training. They just weren't getting it, like not even close. And the role they came from was fairly similar. Not only were they not performing well, they would randomly go AWOL for long periods of time during the day. This was a high availability position for when you were on shift. We had just hired and trained 5 other people who were all further ahead in half the time of the same program. So I went to my boss, told him, so-and-so is not the right fit for customer X. They should probably get a different customer if we keep them at all. Boss decides to make it simple and tell the contracting company to let them go. Logic was, what if they need to cover the hard customer? Behavior wasn't acceptable anyway. Person loses their crap and spams me across both LinkedIn and the company messaging platform. Guess access wasn't disabled. HR got involved, formal apologies issued. It was a whole thing fast forward a few years, and I became the hiring manager on the team. I opened a request, and a different contracting company puts the resume of that same person in front of me. I notified them that I expect to find out if someone was fired for this role in the past, and if so, skip that candidate. Story 39. Not HR was doing clinical rotations as a pharmacy student, and I was given a heads up that one of the patients I was seeing in clinic has been in jail for like 15 years. Looked him up. He did in fact do some murder. Nicest guy. Story 40. I had a guy that was convicted of assaulting a patient at the hospital he worked out. He insisted that after spending time in prison for his crime, he was a changed man. We decided that since we were also a hospital, it wasn't worth the risk. Story 41. So, we hired a guy who made it through interviews with flying colors. He had a great resume and seemed like a great fit for our team. IDK why, but our background checks can take a long time, like, this guy was halfway through 6-week training when his came back in. When word went around that backgrounds were coming in, he seemed nervous and overly chatty about everything in life, but suddenly blurted out during a break time that he wasn't going to pass his background check because he was framed for something he didn't even do. Long story short, he was charged with CP, except he didn't actually do it. He had someone who worked for his apt complex on his Wi-Fi, supposedly. Either way, he was fired and we're still dealing with the waves. Story 42. I cannot begin to tell you how many people apply to a driving job with a long driving infraction record, suspended or revoked licenses. And my favorite never even had one before. They think we're not serious about background checks and commercial insurance. That's the most what the heck. Story 43. Managed a liquor store, had 2. We did Google searches on all applications. Worst was he listed himself as self-employed handyman. According to the news story, he was arrested like 2 months prior as a major local substances dealer. Second, like, we've had a couple apply with DISQUALIFIED, but one hit someone and he passed. Story 44. Oh, I've got 2 fun ones for this. One was hiring an intern for a startup I was working at about 15 years ago. Bunch of college kids were submitting resumes and one had her Twitter on it. Fairly unusual in those days since Twitter was pretty new. So we checked it out, and it was a fully public log of her rampant substance, including pictures and videos and graphic stories of parties. The worst part was that this particular woman was a direct referral from the CEO because he was buddies with her dad. We were just supposed to interview her as a formality. Then we had to go to the CEO and tell him it was a no. 2. There was a woman my friend went to college with who was arrested when she assaulted her ex-boyfriend at his apartment and became known as the Balls Crusher. It got a little media coverage in the local press, but nothing major. The problem for her is she has a very unique name, and even to this day, 15 years later, when I Google her, the second search result is an article about this assault along with her mugshot from the arrest. The first result is her LinkedIn. I'm sure she's had to battle with that headline for her entire professional life. Probably tough on her dating life too, actually. Story 45. I was a sales manager for a big events company and came back from holiday to be told, this guy applied for a different position, but we thought he would be much better suited to the sales team. He starts Monday. Okay, no big problem there. Happy to give the guy a shot despite not being involved in the hiring process. Monday rolls around and he is actually a really nice guy and seems to be pretty competent at the job. Our little office tradition was whenever you got your first sale, we would have a little party at your desk, and instead of just a name on the sales board, we would stick a funny picture next to your name. Usually just some old embarrassing photo we'd find on your social media. So he gets his first sale. I type his very unique name into Google, and the very first search result is a 10-year-old news article, including mugshot, of him being arrested and charged for substances possession with intent to supply. He'd done 5 years in prison. I instantly go into HRS office and ask if they knew. Their faces dropped. Now the issue is, I don't mind giving people second chances, but the job requires international travel to the events we're selling, including countries he'd be required to get a visa for. HR let him go the same day. Story 46. A lady ran for tax collector in my township. She was trying to unseat a long-term incumbent. When I Googled her, I found she'd committed tax fraud and been found guilty. She was running on a campaign of integrity. Luckily, she didn't win. She lost very badly. Story 47. Worked retail in Alaska and saw my fair share of interesting characters. From just your average bad vibe sorts to someone who told me he was currently evading arrest, I've seen it all. Had this one guy I really liked. He was kind, professional, smart, and well-spoken. He just really wanted a day job since he worked nights in a kitchen. I decided I wanted to hire him about halfway through the interview. As we were wrapping up, I asked him if he had any questions for me, and that's when he told me he had just gotten out of jail after a 6-year stint. He told me he wanted to be upfront about it, so I wasn't surprised later. My heart sank. The company I worked for had just started doing background checks for every prospective new hire after years of only requiring them for manager. I told him I was sorry, but if he wasn't going to pass a background check, it wasn't going to work out. We talked for a bit longer, and I gave him the names of a few local businesses that I knew would give him a shot. Hope he's doing well. It was only part-time work that paid $12 an hour. I thought I was bullcrap to background check someone for that wage. Story 48. A guy we had interviewed looked pretty good on paper, but had a big resume gap that he was definitely lying about. We just got a weird feeling about it, so a coworker and I Googled him and found an article about how he beat his ex-girlfriend. This was a job where he could have been working with non-verbal autistic people. We ended up passing on him and let other agencies in the area know about him. Story 49. Interviewed a guy's ex-wife one time. She told me that he had another wife and had 2 kids with her. She found out when she was at a party and the other woman was there. Several women were talking about husbands and thought the two had a lot in common. Then they showed each other a picture of their respective husband. Same guy. Oh, no telling how that went down when she got home. By the way, he denied it to her. She divorced him, and to this day denies it was him. I don't think it was on his background info packet he fills out. Story 50. Not HR, but one of my favorite work stories from a coworker. It's a Saturday afternoon before a huge back-end system conversion. My friend is working with this contractor, tying up loose ends and doing some prep. This contractor has done most of the heavy lifting on the project, and a general godsend for us. My buddy gets a call from the tech lead of the project telling to go somewhere private and call him back. He can't tell my friend why, but the contractor is going to be terminated and walked out of the building later that day. My friend needs to get and document all of the passwords and other important intel, then call the lead back. Like a secret agent, he spends the next hour or two documenting stuff without arousing any suspicion, makes the call back, and contractor guy is done. No one is allowed to give any details about why. The contractor was from out of state and had to make some odd travel arrangements, which he said were about his dog. This made management suspicious, so they looked into him. A big article in a local newspaper had him as part of 20 guys arrested in an escort sting operation. On the upside for him, the conversion was a flaming dumpster fire, so he dodged working a couple of 60-hour weeks cleaning it up. Story 51. Had a guy apply to my job when I was the hiring man. His girlfriend came along for the interview and hung out in the store the entire time. Thought it was a little strange, but not too weird. Maybe they had plans after? Anyway, he lists his previous job as a reference where he was an assistant manager at a local fast food shop. I call the manager. She says he's great, but I shouldn't hire him because of his girlfriend. I ask what she means. This guy's girlfriend would hang out in the store all day long, and when the manager started promoting this guy, his girlfriend took it as the manager was interested in him and began making comments, causing scenes. Manager asks him to have his girlfriend stay at home, or at least in the car and not in the restaurant while he was working since it was causing issues. Manager a few days later gets jumped after closing the store by the girlfriend, a lot of wounds. Suddenly the girlfriend coming with him to the interview seemed a lot more telling. I even found the news article online to verify it was a real story. He wasn't hired. Story 52. My daughter just had this happen to her about a month or two ago, and this is too stupid to make up. Dude came into her store at the mall and tried to rob her. She did not have a key or access to open the register. Then he asked for her money. Key holder was on a bathroom break. She said she didn't have any and laughed at him, saying maybe he should try working because he made a crafty robber. So he asked for a job application. She gave him one and he filled it out and left. My daughter's coworker came in as he was walking out, and my daughter told her the story. She said the sister store next door is also down a member because she's on lunch. My daughter ran through the backside, and lo and behold, guy's there trying to rob the sister store. He takes one look at my daughter and asks if it's the same store. Sister stores? Get out! Mall security is called. Turns out this guy went to several stores and didn't get a dime. Security was asking for descriptions, and my daughter remembers the application and fishes it out of the trash. Dude put his actual information on the application. Police were called in and went to his house and arrested for 6 counts of attempted robbery. Story 53. In the UK, we have something called a DBS check for any workers that are going to be working with kids or vulnerable adults. Most things on your record used to get cleansed after 10 years, but a while back they changed the rules, so some stuff was no longer cleansed, which meant old convictions suddenly started showing up even though they'd been trouble-free for 10 years. At a carers agency, I had to recheck one of our workers, as you do every few years. She was about 50 probably, never had any problems with it. But with the rule change, her background check suddenly flagged something. I had a check on the paper and the list was as long as my arm. Escort, theft, a crap ton, caught with substances, intent to distribute. The list went on. She was a mild-mannered older lady who was great with the clients, but I obviously had to flag to management. They had to have a long conversation, and why she'd never said anything. All in the past, long time ago, never thought it would come up. And to be fair, with the precious rules, she didn't have to declare it. Unfortunately, she was sacked, as the company's policy was no criminal records, which I always thought was a shame. Story 54. Obligatory, not HR. Many moons ago, I worked as a bank teller. Another teller was hired, and one day, a couple of months after he was hired, he stuffed his pockets with all of the cash in his drawer at the end of his shift and walked out. For those that will inevitably ask how he did this, at the end of a shift, each teller was responsible for bringing their cash drawer from their teller station to the vault, using their own code on their own section of the vault. There are, of course, cameras in the vault room, but there were blind spots in ours. Also, all of the monitors with the video feeds from all the security cameras were in the vault room, so it was easy to figure out where the blind spots were. He went alone into the vault room to lock his drawer away, completely normal, put all the cash in his pockets, roughly $30,000, and walked out normally. He was fired, obviously, but never charged because there was no evidence, no video, he wouldn't admit anything. A couple of years later, I was at a new job looking to hire an assistant, was reviewing applications and found that Mr. Sticky Fingers was in need of a new position. Adding that application to the circular file was incredibly satisfying. Story 55. People lying about receiving college degrees and how long they actually were in college. People lying about reasons they left a job. People lying about job titles and what they did at the job. Story 56. Different angle. I was working for a Fortune 50 company in a senior role and agreed to be a reference for a guy I had known for about a decade who was in need of a break. He was excelling in his position until a DUI showed up on his background about 2 years later. He was terminated immediately because he didn't divulge it when submitting his info pre-offer. Kicker is that if he had, it would not have been an issue. But he lied. From well into 6 figures to working construction and getting caught up in substance. Lost his wife, home, and ability to see his children. Story 57. Worked next to title office. They needed a receptionist. One resume said at the very bottom as a footnote, "When life gives you lemons, get some tequila and call me." The owner of the business had everyone read the resume to ask if they could spot the giant red flag. Story 58. I run BGCS third party for people that receive in-home supportive care. The most common disqualifiers are theft, identity fraud, possession with intent, and public assistance fraud. Only convictions disqualify. So we need documented outcome for anything returned as pending. This will matter in the second case below. I distinctively remember the most absurd checks that did not disqualify the candidates. First was for explosives, but it wasn't to property, so technically didn't disqualify per Medicaid state bar list. Second was pending attempted homicide. When I looked into the outcome, it was ongoing, but she was about to plea to reckless endangerment. Found through news articles that she was in her 40s and recently married a veterinarian in his 80s. His son had been taking her to court over power of attorney. Then she went and hit her husband. I had a good rapport with the client and let her know that while the candidate technically passed, she, the client, should probably do a Google search before hiring. She did not proceed to hire her, but technically, since it was being reduced to reckless endangerment, it would not have disqualified her. Story 59. I work for the call center of a big bank in Belgium. There was once a guy hired and in training when it was discovered he had hacked several big tech companies in US. It was missed by the bank's background checks since that was not one of their focus points to check. Story 60. I had a friend who was doing a background for an applicant to get hired for a state agency law enforcement position. The applicant was a female, minority, and bilingual, so big win for a state job. The background was still undergoing and sketchy things started to show up, like family members possibly involved in gangs, substance, etc. A very high-ranking member of the department was pushing to get her hired and wanted to show her how things worked in a certain department. His brilliant idea was to give her access to computer system, where she had access to run criminal history, court records, DMV, everything a sworn officer had access to, and more. She had her own logon and password. A few days later, it was discovered her entire family are in a major gang, serious violent criminal history and substances trafficking. They were using her as an in to get access. It worked. When discovered, her access was blocked, and they shut everything down until they completed researching what she had accessed. It was all kept very quiet. Anyone else would have gotten fired. He retired and is working at another state law enforcement job in a high-ranking position. Story 61. Worked in HR straight out of college, and we had one woman apply who had a police record for escort. Can't remember if she ever got hired, but we didn't turn her away straight away because she declared it up front, and it was from 30 years previously. Story 62. HR putting temp labor programs in place at big companies for 25 years. I have a ton. My most recent is a guy who passed everything. Tech went great, but not too good at the English for a guy who's supposedly been here 25 years. Ghosted when we asked for an in-person. Story 63. A delivery driver applied for and was offered a job until it came back that they had a suspended license from a DWI conviction 2 months prior, and it would remain suspended for the next 10 months. This position was in the recreational cannabis industry to boot. Story 64. Had a dishwasher at a restaurant. I ran that was more than a little off he would be in the dish pit and just start yelling at the dishwasher or the spray handle and would mumble things under his breath constantly. Just give me a really creepy, weird vibe to the point I paid for a background check. Turned out he had hit a guy with his bare hands while he was high and guy pass at his girlfriend's trailer. He passed at the hospital later. Somehow he got out on a technicality after just 5 years. The owner wouldn't get rid of the dude after I told him. So I had to get everyone else at work together and tell him we weren't going to work with a damn offender. I'm all for rehabilitation, but anyone that hit a people needs to GTFO. Story 65. My wife works a job that requires regular background checks and has a very, very common and married name. Let's call her maiden name Jane L. Waters. And now she's Jane L. Wilson, and she has no criminal record. There's another Jane Waters who married a Mr. Wilson and was the same birthday, but different year and middle name. That other Jane has a record. Whenever they run a simple instant background search for Jane Wilson, they get the lady who has several DUIs and a fraud conviction. They have to run the full check with birth date and social to filter her out. Story 66. Not with a background check, but during a group application, job introduction. Someone's phone went missing. They searched everywhere, but nothing. Conclusion was that it had to be stolen by someone in that room, and the trainer decided to call the police. Just before they showed up, a guy suddenly found the phone under his chair. He didn't get the job. Story 67. Was interviewing an intern for a summer graphic designer position. He loaded up his zip disk, 2001, and the blood left his face. He brought a disc filled with adult film instead of his work. Story 68. I always do a quick Google search of applicant. Had one that was arrested for theft on 2 separate occasions. I kind of wanted to bring him in just to meet him, but ultimately I didn't have time for that crap. Twice! Story 69. My team managed a high-profile construction project. We required every tradesperson to be substances tested prior to starting work on the project. It was not a secret, and we always had people trying to work around the system. One day, a middle-aged gentleman submitted a pre-employment urine sample, and the temperature indicator on the container showed that the urine was not warm enough to really be his fresh sample. Again, this was very common, and we saw people try to get away with this tactic over and over again. When the EMT confronted the gentleman, he swore up and down that it was his pee. When the EMT explained that the temperature was not high enough to be a fresh sample, he still declared that it was his pee. When the EMT said that the sample tested positive for Met, the gentleman screamed, "My grandson is a good boy. He doesn't do Met." Needless to say, that gentleman was not allowed on our site. Story 70. A candidate had a great interview, was about to get hired, and then I got an angry call. Apparently, someone Googled him, and his nickname was similar to the likes of Dirty Horace or something like that. Seemed that he had a side gig in local politics, but had groped some coworkers in a parking garage. Story 71. About 20 years ago, I was interviewing candidates for an assistant position. It came down to 2 options, both with similar credentials and not much adult life work experience, so I Googled them to see what I might find. One was featured in an article about helicopter parenting. Her mother was quoted in the article as saying she had called her daughter's employer and complained about the very standard hours they worked, and she felt entitled to involve herself in her daughter's work. We immediately round-filed that resume and hired the other candidate. Story 72. The job listing we had is for a youth coordinator, which requires being able to go into schools in the county on a regular basis, work with kids directly, and act as a liaison between our program and the school district. Needless to say, they need to have a clean record to even be considered as a candidate for the job because of the strict fingerprinting requirements that come with working with kids in the school system. Person applies for a job. Resume says they were a high-profile sports ball athlete in the 80s and 90s. We Googled them. Homie was charged with multiple counts of domestic violence and abuse, multiple assault and battery charges, multiple DUIs, 2 counts of attempted kidnapping, and some others I forget. This was all just on the first page of Google. I'm sure there are other charges. They had only just been released from prison the month prior to applying. Story 73. I used to do background screening, and the worst I'd seen was someone who had been convicted of offenses, but hadn't disclosed it on the application for their employer. Obviously, it made me feel sick corresponding with them, as I had to let them know they were not successful and the reason why. There was another where someone had stolen a load of stock from their employer and sold it on eBay, but got caught out through serial numbers. Generally, though, most people who didn't get their employment approved had lied about the dates of employment with previous employers. Generally, once the basic trust has been eroded, the employer is no longer interested in the candidate. Story 74. I was HR for a gaming corporation, and we were in the process of hiring a technician. The guy had requested a reschedule for his in-person interview for the following week. Hiring manager was okay with it. I didn't need him in person, but he interviewed really well with the hiring manager, and they wanted to go ahead with an offer of employment. In that time, I ran a background screen. Turned out that the reason for the rescheduled interview was because Les Tian, a month ago, a couple days after our phone screening interview, he was charged with possession of substances with intent to traffic and timed his interview around his court date. Obviously emailed his rescinded job offer and screened his calls for a week after. Ironically, he reapplied to the senior accountant position and messaged on Indeed he was a former employee, factory tech, and just got his accounting degree a month later. Story 75. I worked at a school, and someone we had interviewed for a job there had a conviction. He'd been a bare-knuckle boxer for many years and wasn't capable of closing his hands fully anymore. Story 76. We've not hired people simply for having an account for escort. We also found out a guy settled on an abuse charge from when he was younger, threw his application right in the trash. Story 77. A woman that was not a close friend but was in my social circle came to me for work. I couldn't hire her because she was convicted of hitting her son's legs. Story 78. I used to work for a mom and pop warehouse staffing firm, and we'd run background checks on everybody. And you'd see the usual suspect: substances, possession, driving with suspended license, etc. But the most memorable was an older gentleman who came back as a registered offender. And when I called him to tell him that we couldn't place him at any of our clients, he, unsolicited, told me the whole story of what happened and why he thought his conviction was bullcrap. Story 79. Worked at a homeless shelter for veterans, and my coworker told me to Google my boss's name. Man stole over $50,000 from his previous school's sports budget over years at a school he taught at. Meanwhile, he was running a non-profit homeless shelter for the city. Needless to say, the place shut down pretty quickly after I got hired due to mismanagement. We pretty much had no caseworker for the last month due to her going to lunch with the boss for hours. Story 80. I'm not HR, but my former boss and the HR director at my job hated each other. The HR director is petty as duck, he's still HR, and did a deep dive into my boss's employment history and discovered that he had fabricated a lot of his resume and references. He said he was an assistant director at a major food company, when in reality, he was a lab tech. His references were all former co-workers of his who agreed to embellish his career. He also ran email he wrote through Chagup before sending it, which, who cares? But he was obsessive about pretending that he wrote them all himself. Story 81. I did background verification for a trucking company. A lot of drivers on the registry without disclosing, but the two that I remember most. One guy was a former cop who had been arrested for making videos with his wife but plead down to accessing the dark web. The article still haunts me of what really happened. And the other was a man on the registry who said we should still hire him because the assault was digital penetration only. Absolutely horrific. These men were not at all ashamed or excusing of their disgusting crimes and really couldn't understand why we weren't going to hire them to drive a truck. Story 82. I worked for a company that processed background checks. We didn't approve or deny them. One day, this woman calls in and says, I defecated in my neighbor's lawn, but I still can volunteer. No hello, no explanation. That was her opening sentence. Apparently, a school had denied her to volunteer with elementary school kids because of the pending charges of trespassing, public nudity, and criminal mischief. It was over an HOA dispute, apparently. She was on the HOA board. We did not force the school to approve her. We have been laughing about it for almost a year, and it's a standard story to tell me hires. Story 83. I quickly found that he was a suspect in the Green River killings. Yeah, he didn't do it. We all know that was Gary Ridgway, but he had the aura and the confidence of the offender, not someone I want to work with. I reported this to me boss, who hired him. Ended up getting his teeth knocked out the first day when he said a co-worker's wife's had nice tits. Story 84. I worked in a family practice doctor's office. He did pre-employment physicals for a number of nearby companies. The physical form they filled out asked, do you drink alcohol? If yes, what type and how much? Do you use substances? If yes, what type and how often? You'd be amazed at the answers. 3 cases of beer a week. Substances, but only on the weekends. I'm thinking, this is a physical to get a job. What the heck are you thinking the doc is going to recommend to the employer? This sets aside all the various shenanigans by people trying to game a substances test. Story 85. A guy I considered a friend in high school turned in his laptop to get it updated. They found one file of CP that he neglected to delete. It opened the door to a bigger investigation where they found thousands of files on his personal. No one would have known but for that one file on his work laptop. I was shocked. Story 86. Worked as a GM in a mid-luxury clothing store. Like, not Gucci level, but Gucci was 2 doors down from us. We had a regular customer who everyone loved who applied to work for us part-time because he figured he was there enough he might as well get a discount. Background check came back and he had theft and embezzlement charges from when he worked in our exact location 13 years prior. Wasn't flagged by our application system because he changed his last name somewhere down the line. Story 87. Former position over a decade ago. Bright guy. Busting his tail in construction to put himself through school. Background check came up. Instant nope. Criminal record halfway across the country, 20 years before. Story 88. Called a reference and got a who. Thought I dialed wrong or maybe an old number wasn't updated, but before I could hang up after apologizing for the error, I hear in the background, paraphrasing, "Hey, is name using the name now? Trying to avoid this." Story 89. Surreptitious viewing. Had no clue what that was when it showed up on the background check. Turned out the candidate was caught hiding cameras in the women's bathroom at his previous workplace. They confiscated loads of footage and pictures across multiple devices. Sicko. I still think of it every time I have to use the bathroom in public. Story 90. I used to do credentialing for travel nurses. Travel nurses are either hyper-competent individuals or absolutely insane people, with very little in between. I have lots of stories, but the one that sticks out to me the most. I ran a background check on this woman, which included her aliases. She had 8 different aliases. I verified it and, 8 aliases. I asked her about it, and she, way too casually, says she was married 7 times. She convinced 7 separate people to marry her. She was 38. Story 91. Not HR, but it's too good not to share. I joined the Air Force many years ago and met another recruit who seemed very qualified. He had been raised in Japan. He spoke English and Japanese. He was a high school wrestler. He scored very high on the ASVAB. The recruiter found out that he didn't have a criminal record in the U.S. He did have a record in Japan where he was busted for selling substances to an undercover cop. He spent several months in jail until a congressman intervened and he was deported to the USA. Story 92. My job outsourced talent during pandemic. One of the contractors ended up being terminated. Turns out, they were arrested and charged with murder. From my understanding, they did not pull the trigger, but was in fact the driver who took the murder suspect to and from the location. My colleague's significant other is a defense attorney, and just so happened they ended up representing them for this case. Story 93. HR here. Murder is probably the most shocking. I think most awkward was when I had to tell a candidate they were not eligible for the role. It was a driving role, which meant it involved a motor vehicle report. Because they had so many points on their license, it had been suspended, and they had a warrant out for their arrest. They had moved from a different state and legitimately thought that the crimes didn't travel from state to state and they could get a new license without any points or history. Story 94. I didn't even get to the background check. Someone showed up asking about the now hiring sign, so I was just talking about the jobs we're hiring for, what the general qualifications, etc. They didn't have a resume on them, but would email me one later that day. Didn't. I then asked, what kind of work background do you have? He answered, oh, just one prior with a handgun. Dude thought I was asking about his arrest background. What the heck? My shop is in Baltimore City. So yeah. Story 95. Former background investigator for an East Coast Lee. Big boss wanted a certain applicant because the father of the applicant was a local politician. Does your son have any history of substances use? A. My son? Of course not. Surprise. Son missed months of school. I got to see the archived school records because he was in rehab for substances. Applicant denied. Story 96. Worked at a nursing home where we did a full fingerprint check on everyone in the building. Guy applied to work in the kitchen and we told him we would background check him. Is there anything we should know about? He told us he had a charge for murder, but didn't think it should matter because he was going to work in the kitchen. Nope. Story 97. I worked in HR. There was a candidate who applied for the role of, funny enough, HR manager. It was learned that she was released not too long ago for being involved in an embezzlement scheme at a casino, and the job she applied for was for a casino. Story 98. Years ago when I was starting my company, I mentioned in passing to an associate of mine that I was looking for a bookkeeper to help get the financials in order. He immediately said, oh, dude, I can do it. I've been doing bookkeeping for years. I know all the ins and outs and I can cook the numbers. This one client I had, I managed to sneak a few thousand from them in a year. I just blinked at him in disbelief. Story 99. I worked for a company that didn't do background checks. We got a new manager for our call center, and he was so nice, charismatic, funny, approachable, but didn't know anything about our industry, just kind of an odd hire. Some people were wondering about him. 5 minutes of Googling later showed he'd been fired from his last place for identity theft and fraud. In his role, he would have had complete access to our customer records, credit cards, and all. Story 100. Statute of limitations at my job is 7 years, but we can still deny someone depending on the severity of the crime. Guy beat someone almost to death 8 years ago and thought he could still get through. Another guy got in a big fight and accidentally beat guy who was in the vicinity, and he passed. Also tried arguing that it wasn't a big deal. Story 101. Not related to a job, but one time my ex-girlfriend's sister decided to run a check on me only to have my father's information come back. His middle name is my first name. And she went to my girlfriend asking why I was lying about my age. I was 25 at the time, and my dad was 53. We laughed and went, "Well, I look damn good for 53 inches. Her sister was mightily embarrassed about this, Story 102. I work in a niche field parallel to HR, and one small part of my job is to review applications, polygraphs, and questionnaires, plus run background checks on people trying to become state troopers. Applicants freely admitting to use and selling of hard substances background checks. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of domestic violence and protection orders. Story 103. I had a buddy who had the world's most common first, middle, and last name. Basically something like Michael John Smith. They were born on the same day in the same hospital as someone with the same exact name. And that other person grew up to be a felon. Needless to say, it caused problems on my friend's background checks. Story 104. The place I work hires anybody, performs background checks, but I'm currently working with a copycat who likes to assault people with sledgehammers, has an F1 and 2. I want to know who they actually deny. Story 105. I had a landlord Google me, found someone a few states away, nothing in common except age and third of my name. Different look even. Took quite a bit to get her to recognize it wasn't me. A quick glance at our faces should have been enough. He had a heck of a rap sheet and was currently in prison, so that shouldn't given it away too. Story 106. It was a story I heard from my boss. We work in law enforcement. She interviewed a guy whose name came up in a serial killer investigation by the same agency he applied to. Detectives had interviewed him several years prior to this because 3 of the murdered women had his number. They were escorts. He did not get the job. Story 107. Not a background investigator, but outdid one. Sister is an instructor for Fire Academy up in Oregon. Was telling me about a recruit that had some issues. They got a letter from the state of California about him, and they couldn't figure out why. Nothing came up. I Googled his name and added California arrest. He was arrested and found guilty of murder in 2004. Story 108. I worked at a grocery store once upon a time. The manager's wife was looking for houses in the area, thought to check the Megan's Law website, and found a new hire with multiple convictions that was working primarily with girls. HR personnel of Reddit. What's the most unnecessary thing you've seen in a resume? I was shortlisting resumes for my boss and came across one that was absolute damn gold. The position was for a tape operator at a television station. The guy was an artist, and his resume was a 31-page visual representation of his journey through life. Each page contained a moment in time that had shaped him into who he was as a man, as one of the Earth Mother's children, and as an artist. There were pictures of his art, and it wasn't great. There also wasn't a cover letter or a contact email, and there was a lot of "the Earth Mother birthed me from her glistening bowels" kind of stuff. To this day, I don't know if he was serious, or if he was damn with us and submitted it to get his application numbers up to meet his mutual obligation requirement for job seeker. Story 2. My department at the lab got an application for a senior position. Requires experience, a pertinent degree, and references from the last lab, all while you must be at least 18. We got a 16-year-old whose experience read that he did his high school's chemistry lab and proclaimed that because he had done that class, he was now qualified to work in a substances testing lab. Oh, he also wrote in his cover letter that substances tests would never be done on him because he was immune to the effects of substance and therefore could take them. Our HR person keeps that CV and cover letter framed. It's the craziest one we've had yet. Story 3. I've seen it posted on some of the military subs, but there's an infamous resume that listed the following under experience. U.S. military, United States Marine Corps, rank spouse. For the record, I'm a military spouse. My wife and I were both in the military. I got out about 3 years ago, and she's still in. There are definitely situations where communicating that you're a military spouse is relevant. You want to impress that constant job turnover isn't because you can't hold a job, but rather that you're frequently moving. As much as we like to clown on the military spouses that take themselves too seriously, military spouses are occasionally forgotten about, and the overwhelming majority of them are just regular people. With that said, the horror stories of spouses that want preferential treatment, benefits, or respect that they might not have earned are real. Pretty much everyone in the military has a story of their own, or has heard about a spouse who doesn't get it. Listing United States Marine Corps spouse under work experience on a resume is an example that's pretty on brand for the stereotypical military spouse who doesn't get it. Story 4. Had a guy apply for a supervisor position. Listed the companies he worked for, but not the positions he held. And then the other half of the page was filled with personal records for different weightlifting exercises. I interviewed him because I felt like I had to interview someone that was willing to submit a resume like that. He spent most of the interview talking about how much time he spends at the gym. No matter what the question was, he was able to relate it to the gym. He didn't get the job. Story 5. Not as bad as some of the ones here, but I once had a guy hand me a resume with smiley faces on it, like the generic Microsoft version of they were typed right in next to his previous experience. Like, cashier at Walmart, smile. Story 6. Straight out of college and living in small town riddled with substances users, I seriously considered putting consistently pass random substances screening in my skills section. Manager friend told me that would actually be valuable. Story 7. One candidate wrote The Lost Art of Letter Writing as an additional qualification. Another submitted a hand-drawn comic book. It was quite entertaining and well done. Story 8. Not seen by me personally, but by my boss. We received an application for a position. We could see past the typos as writing isn't exactly a large part of the job, but referring to his previous jobs as being boring and not paying enough to get out of bed for wasn't their brightest move. The real turnoff was signing it ready to work. Story 9. Silly answer. I had a guy once submit a resume that said, worked with Annie for 5+ years with no other explanation of what Annie was. Annie, it turned out, was a dog he worked with. Unclear because his resume did not state that he worked with animals. General answer. Inspirational quotes or company specific. I'm always amazed by how many resumes I see that struggle to fit on a page. 2 pages but find space to include a large graphic with a generic inspirational quote about pursuing dreams. Similarly, why include 2 lines about the merits you received at your company if you're not going to explain what they are? Story 10. Not in HR, but had to hire a couple people in the past. One of the applicants included that he was on his high school's homecoming court on his resume. Obviously, I didn't hire him. Dude wasn't even king. Story 11. It has been many years since I worked in HR, but I do remember a resume that was 30 pages long for a stay-at-home mother applying for her first job. It was very odd and mostly incoherent. Story 12. Various highlights, all different people. 1. Listed qualifications he felt he had achieved from the University of Life, and listed things he thought he was great at, but had no actual formal qualifications for: automotive engineering, science, etc. 2. Another guy had been to 4 different universities, done 1 or 2 years at each, but never actually finished, and just decided he'd done enough to get a degree and listed them all as institutions too. Under hobbies, listed coffee. 3. Various email addresses, hot chick, hot bum, etc. 4. Many awful glamour headshots, including an A4 glossy of a dude casually, awkwardly sitting on the edge of a desk in front of a bookshelf. 5. A woman who applied for an admin job and her work history was 20 straight years of fashion modeling. She was gorgeous. She had no other experience. I didn't interview her. I got abused by male colleagues for not giving the job to the hot chick. I think I did her a good turn. Story 13. This is in the US, and I understand some other countries and likely industries do it differently, but one of my professors said she just tosses out resumes that have pictures on it because the people have nothing relevant to the job. And people are trying to get jobs based on their looks. I have read all the resumes that I got with pictures, and that professor has been right so far. I don't trust that rule as to do it every time yet, but it's been right so far. Story 14. 2 things. We had someone apply for a technical position who had a degree in spirit, nature, and value. We had a guy apply for a quality assurance position who included a link to his LinkedIn profile. I opened the profile and he had given himself the title of quality assurance. Story 15. I'm going to spin this around. What wasn't written? I interviewed a candidate and it turned out one of his parents was Chinese and the other Indian. His English was fine, and he claimed to be fluent in Mandarin and Hindi. It was pretty clear he wasn't getting the job, just didn't have the skill set needed. But I liked him, so I mentioned, right. The fact you can speak to about 40% of the human race might be something you want to put on your resume for next time instead of your love of baseball. Story 16. I've gotten Jeopardy contestant and Wheel of Fortune winner before. Also had a guy write a whole paragraph about how strong his immune system is and that he never gets sick. Story 17. Highlights from my favorite resume ever. We were hiring a receptionist to answer the phone for a party rental company. Networked and partied with celebrities. Handle my alcohol well. Ability to stand. Story 18. At an old position, hiring for university at help desk, we got a resume that listed 18 pages of links from the internal university info page. Like links of Wi-Fi info, 18 pages, just URLs. I don't even remember what was on the first couple pages. I just remember being baffled that this person thought URLs qualified as experience. Story 19. My friend had one where he was hiring for an IT job, and once he was with this historian, and he had a resume that was with all his accomplishments. This is normal, but in the end he had stole 12 consecutive ham sandwiches from a coworker. Story 20. Oh crap, I have another one. Buckle up. I was hiring ESL teachers in China, and boy, oh boy, do some real freaks pop up. An older American gentleman sent in his CV, and it was bonkers, so I called him for a phone interview. During our 20M call, he made the following claims. He was dating a 21-year-old spy. He sketched diagrams of super tankers in his free time and took them to the offices of shipping companies to see if they wanted to buy his blueprint. The Turkish Minister of Antiquities admitted to him personally, in a Nye limo, that the real site of Troy is in England. There is an alien in his head, I forget the name, but yes, it had a name, who tells him the secrets of the universe. Also, the alien isn't a real alien. He invented it, so the CIA can't blame him for his amazing theories. They have to blame the alien. He also wrote some books, one of which I still totally have, so if you want to read some of the craziest crap ever, PM me and I'm happy to email it your way. Story 21. Not HR, but a friend asked me to look at his CV to help him get into programming. It was 5 pages listing his exams from when he 14 to his PhD. Work experience of any minor job he has ever had, 1 week in a shop, 5 days in a hotel, etc. Coding languages he hadn't touched in forever. I trimmed it to 1 page, removed 90% of it, and was like, in this section, describe your PhD project on automation AI. And in this section, describe your manager experience at the grocery shop. List any achievements in both sections. Like, thanks to my work in automation, I was able to streamline X process. If they ask why the gap in employment, just explain you were focusing on the PhD. Only list languages you can actually code in or talk about. The others you can mention in conversation as a, I have worked with it, but I'd need a refresher. He got hired 2 weeks later and then moved country about 6 months after that and works for some startup. Really smart and genuine guy, just couldn't write a CV to save his life. Story 22. An employee I fired for theft reapplied the following year. On her resume, under her job description and experience for my business, she put down my job duties as the owner. She apparently was in charge of hiring and firing staff, making employee schedules, payroll, and managing the office. Her real duties were answering the phone and greeting clients as they arrived for appointments. None of that could even remotely be stretched to include the duties she claimed she had. Story 23. I'm not Har, but when I was an assistant manager for a dog daycare center, I typically went through the submitted resume. We had one guy submit a resume which included colorful pictures of himself in different situations like a headshot. I then read through his qualifications, and the one that stood out to me was, can touch the rim on a basketball hoop. I'm not sure if this guy was submitting a joke resume or thought being quirky would get him a job at a dog daycare center. We did not call him back as we took our hiring process seriously to make sure we hired the best candidates for the safety and well-being of our dogs. Story 24. That the person had run for a public office in a foreign country and listed that they were members of 2 separate political parties while running for said office. We took a flyer on her. Too soon? Story 25. I don't think they actually look at resume. In the past, for hobbies, I put part-time ninja, and for other skills, pet psychiatrist. During one interview, they were asking me about my skills and writing them on my resume beside the section that listed my skills. Story 26. I'm not HR, but I was the hiring manager of the position. The applicant's resume had a full-page watermark of Gandalf on Shadowfax, Whitehorse, from Lord of the Rings. Apparently, he applied for every technical position we had, as a lot of other hiring managers had seen the same resume. Story 27. Not in HR, but I've been starting to compile my resume after 20 years at the same job and thought about just attaching 20 years of employee yearly reviews I had. And then the last page would be a picture of a microphone on the ground. Definitely a horrible idea, but I think someone would get a kick out of it. I really don't want to work anymore, so I might just do it. Story 28. Not HR, but had a client that in the required education section of an application listed her own self-published program as where she was educated. This was in order to qualify to be recognized as the academic officer for her own institution, where she is the only instructor. Self-taught doesn't satisfy the requirement, ma'am. Story 29. I used to put my IQ on my CV when I first entered the world of work because a teacher once told me it would make me stand out. Cringe. Looking back, I think he might have been pulling my leg, but he was kind of right. Story 30. I was working HR in a heavy industrial equipment manufacturing plant outside of Dallas. This was a couple decades ago, so we still received a lot of paper resumes and applications in the mail, particularly for the hourly jobs. I received a resume for a highly skilled welder position that was absolutely doused in cologne. Smelled up my office for hours after I opened the envelope. I can still smell. Taste the odor of that resume. Also received a resume in a box once for a professional office position at one of my stops. Included in the box was a single shoe and a note saying they wanted to put their best foot forward in applying for the job. They didn't meet the requirements for the position, so box, shoe, resume were quickly introduced to the circular file. Story 31. Not HR, but was on a team where they let all of us look at the resumes for people who were going to be interviewed, as one of us sat in on them all. One person literally quoted themselves, like they said something that sounded somewhat profound and literally quoted themselves. Story 32. I have one where the lack of a resume was the whole problem. The restaurant I worked at was hiring. A girl walked in with a bunch of shopping bags and said, "Hi, I would like to apply for the position," in an extremely cheery manner. My boss asked for her resume, and her answer was, "I don't have one, because I am the resume. I can tell you all about myself, and I think it leaves a more honest impression when we can talk face to face." No crap, Sherlock. Of course you can tell people about your resume. It's your life. But the point of the resume is to have a piece of paper so they can easily review the candidates afterwards. She sounded so smug, like nobody ever thought about the idea of advertising yourself by saying good stuff about it. She did not get hired. Story 33. I used to work as an admissions assistant at a college, and my boss would have me go through resumes for new counselors. One day, I had a very average resume uploaded to our system, so I put it aside to invite to the group interview. That was always the first step in the process. The next day, we got a package in the mail from the applicant with a printed out copy of her resume, normal, in addition to pens, post-it notes, and a compass, the kind for drawing circles, all with her name printed on them and a pun. I don't remember what the pun was. My boss was super weirded out and had me toss her resume. Story 34. Was hiring for entry-level behavioral therapist. Two-part process. Office interview based on resume then. If qualified in clinic with a senior therapist interacting with the clients. Clients were young children. Guy looked good on paper and came in for first interview. Seemed like a reasonable fit. And I scheduled the in-clinic with advice to wear comfortable clothes as there might be interactive play therapy involved. Guy showed up in basketball shorts with a t-shirt. Okay, a little bit into the time he crouched down to get at eye level with a kiddo and it clear that he was freeballing. Add an interview to work with children. Nope. Story 35. I was helping my boss go through applications and saw on one attended summer camp 5 summers in a row. It confused the hell out of me since we were a coffee shop, and she didn't tie in any skills from summer camp. Did she make coffee at summer camp? Did she work on customer skills? What did summer camp have to do with the job she was applying for? Story 36. Super late, but when I was in school, an HR person came in to talk to the class about resumes, and she brought actual resumes people submitted with just a sticky note over the person's name, contact info. I don't know what all the mistakes she was pointing out, but the one I remember clearly was a guy who had down what car he drove on his resume. It wasn't even anything amazing, a Cadillac or something like that. Story 37. Without going into too much detail, this person was applying for an entry-level job. Very nicely formatted resume. But in the job description, they listed everything about the job that they hated and went on to speak about refusing to do certain aspects of the job. These were basic things they were refusing too, like using certain tools during certain aspects of the job that would be necessary to do the job. It was odd. Story 38. Awards. Best Girl Scout, not written on the resume, but I sometimes get resumes via email with unedited, or maybe intentional, file names like plushareem.doc or finalresume.doc. Story 39. This is a fun one. I work on an American company located in Mexico. Hiring managers really appreciate the people that are able to talk English to some degree. So many candidates send their resume in English without knowing much of the language. Anyway, a traditional milling machine is called fresadora in Spanish, and fresa also means strawberry in English. Lo and behold, this candidate listed to have strawberry machine expertise in his resume. He didn't get selected for other reasons. We don't really need machine operators to be fully bilingual, but all my coworkers and I had a good laugh about how ridiculous it sounded. Story 40. I don't work in HR. 3 funniest resume I have ever seen was for an equipment maintenance job. Someone with some sort of mechanical or electronic troubleshooting skills is usually a decent candidate. We have had bad luck with people that only work on cars. A broader skill set is generally needed. Skills, push buttons to activate machines. Okay. This person is henceforth known as the button pusher. I didn't do the interview, but I heard that it did not go well. Another time, HR hired someone without giving my group an interview. He did maintenance. He was a janitor. At least he quit after the first day. He was nice, but totally overwhelmed. Story 41. Not HR, but I look at resumes, the cover letter that tries to be cute. Stop with that crap. On another note, I hope I never have to look for work again. Story 42. Related. When I woke up at midnight for the second time this month to play Tooth Fairy, I told my husband I was going to add Tooth Fairy to my resume. Story 43. Well-known town, well-known journalist for the Anchor newspaper, still there after 20 years, listed his junior year abroad in Europe on his resume. Guy is past 50. I wonder if he forgot it's there. Story 44. A friend once came across a pretty bizarre resume. The only thing I remember is the guy aspired to be manager of Broadway. We're not in the US, and the job had absolutely nothing to do with Broadway or performance of any kind. Story 45. The one that stands out for me is the one that made it stand out. It was sensory overload. All these bright-colored text boxes, different fonts. It was so damn hard to read. Keep it simple and professional, and I don't care if your star sign says you are right for the... Story 46. While sorting through resumes when opening a new restaurant, we got one that stated that the applicant was bilingual and could speak English and Ebonics. Story 47. 1. College cheerleader. Applicant was a 50-year-old woman. Job was a desk job. 2. Extensive, almost job-by-job recount of a 5-year modeling career. For an editor job that required a college degree. Sure, mention it in other employment, but don't make it the centerpiece of your resume. Story 48. One applicant wrote in their cover letter about my cats, by name. They had tracked down my Instagram and looked through my history, so they'd have something personal to say to me. Story 49. I live in Scotland, and once when going through applicants' CVs, there was a young girl who had the words, "and I am a cow," at the end of her bio. Calling a female a cow in Scotland is pretty bad. Equivalent of calling someone an escort. I called her to tell her what it said. She was mortified and said it was probably one of her college pals who wrote it as a joke. Story 50. Had an employee apply for a manager position as a lateral move between departments. He thought that because everyone in the other department knew him, that they were only asking for a resume as a technicality. He then showed up to his interview with the words, "I know how to work good," written in crayon on construction paper, and said it was his resume. He got the job, but only after he submitted a real one. Story 51. I worked in tech support, and we were really short-staffed. Every once in a while, our boss would show us some of the resumes he got to illustrate to us, that we remained short-staffed. Because of the poor quality of candidates, not because he was holding out for the perfect candidate or something. One resume literally listed, "Put hot wings in a bag" as an experience bullet point in a previous job when applying for a tech support role. Story 52. Sometimes people do stupid things with the best intentions. I say this defending myself. I attached a picture of a delicious sandwich I had made and was quite proud of to my application for Subway. I still don't know why I never heard back from them. I fucking love sandwiches. To clarify, this was no ordinary sandwich. It was on Turkish bread with ham, salami, mortadella, egg, cheese, avocado, lettuce, tomato, spinach, salad cream and pepper, toasted. Story 53. I was a supervisor at the time, not a hiring manager, but one of my responsibilities was helping process the incoming mail. We weren't hiring, but we got a resume and application for my team. It was handwritten and listed his only job as dog walker. He also graduated college in like 1980, so should have some real employment. I shredded the resume instead of forwarding it on to my boss because she made questionable choices. Story 50. I had a resume about a year or two ago that, looking back, was filled with references to QAnon and rants about the US turning away from Christianity. The last page was a full-size color picture of his face, with a giant smile, and with a tooth that looked to have been passed for years. Story 55. Not seen by me, but some relatives work in this place where they received a resume with a full-body bikini picture included. It was for an office job. Story 56. I work for a recruiting firm. I've seen shoe size, a high school report card, this person had a college degree and was in their 30s, and a section where someone listed their experience in babysitting rats and hamsters. Story 57 was vetoing applications for my boss. I work at a preschool, mind you. I don't know if this was unnecessary or just plain damn creepy, but the guy wrote down that he has close and personal experience with womans. What was that supposed to mean? I asked my boss permission to burn it. Story 58. My sister was hiring a waiter for her restaurant and had a resume that listed received certification to handle hand grenades, listed under special skills. The guy also had no military experience, just grenades, I guess. Story 59. Once a candidate had inserted something like 12 pictures of himself at the bottom of the resume, including family pics, fishing pics, one with a beer, and one from Halloween where he was dressed like a zombie. One of the pics was of him in a police uniform, so that was somewhat relevant. Security supervisor position, but it was still hilarious. Story 60. I received a resume from a recent college grad who proudly stated she was on the honor roll. I received another from someone who said she had 9 years experience using the internet. Story 61. I used to manage and hire for a coffee shop in the South, us, and I got so many cover letters talking about how they thought this would be a great position for them to serve God and witness to people. Story 62. 2 years of experience as a software developer, but it was a very demanding job, so it counts as 3 years. That resume was 3 pages long and included the logo of every company the guy had worked at, and yet somehow failed to include any detail whatsoever about the actual work he'd done. Story 63. I once had a resume hit my desk that had security clearance level 3 listed as a qualification. Half of this dude's resume was listed as redacted, and there were no government jobs to speak of listed on the resume. He did not get brought in for an interview. Story 64. One person gave a rundown of how much weight they could lift, like bench, deadlift, squat, etc. It was for work in a restaurant, and in the listing, there was the very standard need to be able to lift 25 pounds and be on your feet for 6 hours. But this was next level. Story 65. Not a resume, but when I asked an applicant what her goals were and how working for us fit into her long-term plans, she proudly announced, "I'm going to be governor." She was 17 and too young to get the licensing needed for the position. Didn't see her on the ballot for the last election. Story 66. I have so many from various recruiting experiences, but my favorite was the person who put "not rude" as their second best skill. Interestingly, they didn't make it to interview because of an undeclared conviction for abuse. They were very defensive about this when asked. Story 67. My old manager was recruiting entry-level ESL teachers in China. One guy had a section called Greatest Achievements to Date and had 2 corkers. First was going on a horticulture-themed holiday to Guatemala. Second was learning to operate a fully manual camera. He got the job. He also got fired. So, Story 68. I called someone to ask them to come for an interview, and she said, "I don't want an interview. I just needed to apply in order to get my benefits. If the job center call, can you tell them I had an interview?" Story 69. I'm realizing recruiters don't like cheeky jokes, like saying coffee is an interest, or my extracurricular activities. If I could chainsaw carve, I'd be shoehorning that into every conversation and email. Story 70. One candidate had a section in their resume called Personal Interests, and it included only one dot point, which was following international fashion trends via the medium of magazine, which is a lot of words to say, I only read trash mags. Story 71. On a resume for an IT job, they explicitly stated how their last job enabled them to fry a donut to a crispy golden brown. I'm not sure why that was necessary on their resume, nor why I remember it after 30 years. Story 72. Not a resume, but a candidate for a senior paralegal position brought a 3 inches binder to the interview to show me all her costume pictures where she won first prize in office Halloween contest. Story 73. I work in a homeless program. One of the people came to me with their resume. He had all the times he was arrested, all the awards he got in high school, the award he got at McDonald's, and what his hobbies are. Story 74. Clown training. Hired a girl because of it. She turned out to be amazing, and years later, we are still good friends. She received it working as a clown in a kids' play facility and still has the shoes. Story 75. Back before I became a nurse, I worked for a long time at the service desk at the Home Depot. For a while, I included in my job responsibilities, perform miracles. Story 76. Not hard, but cleaning out my parents' house. I found my dad's 1960 resume, and it included his height, weight, hair color, and listed him as a married with kids. No way you would list that now. Story 77. Not a HR personnel, but the college tutor we had a small business he had decided to into teaching. He saw some strange resumes once stated their dirty fantasy.